What if I told you that there existed an aircraft so far ahead of its time that even today, engineers struggle to fully explain it? An aircraft that flew faster than anything could catch it, faster than aerodynamics allowed, faster than the human brain could process what was happening in the cockpit. Its name was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. And this is one of the most incredible, insane, and underrated stories in aviation history. Today, we're going to break it down piece by piece. The fuel that shouldn't have existed, the wing that broke the laws of physics, the pilots who climbed into this machine knowing everything and still pushed the throttle. Stay until the end, because there is a moment in this video after which you will never look at the wing of a standard airliner the same way again. Let's go. Imagine a man who looks at a bird in flight and doesn't see a bird. He sees an equation. Alexander Lippisch was exactly that kind of man. A German engineer and designer, obsessed with a single idea from the moment he first saw a glider in the sky over Munich as a child. He was convinced that the aircraft of the future should not have a tail. It sounds simple, almost absurd, but behind this simplicity lay something truly revolutionary. A tail on an aircraft is a stabilizer. It keeps the machine in the air, prevents it from tumbling, and dictates direction. Remove it, and the plane becomes a flying disaster. Any engineer will explain that to you, in 5 seconds, with pleasure. Lippisch knew this better than anyone, yet he kept drawing, because he understood something others didn't. At very high speeds, speeds that people were only whispering about in the 1930s, the tail became not a helper, but a problem. It created drag. It limited potential. It was dead weight in a world where every kilogram and every square centimeter mattered. A delta wing without a tail. That was his answer. He built gliders, one after another. He flew them himself, because few others would. He gathered data. He corrected. He flew again. By the late 1930s, he possessed something no one else in the world had. Real experience flying machines that, according to all the textbooks, shouldn't have been able to fly. And here, at this point, the second man in our story enters his life. Wilhelm Messerschmitt. If Lippisch was a dreamer, a man of pencil and intuition, Messerschmitt was his exact opposite. Cold, calculating, an engineer in the strictest sense of the word. A man who looked at a blueprint and saw not an idea, but a production plan, deadlines, costs. They didn't like each other, almost immediately. Lippisch thought Messerschmitt was too grounded. Messerschmitt thought Lippisch was too lost in the clouds, literally. But they had one thing in common. Both understood that the era of piston engines was ending. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon of technology, something fundamentally different awaited, and whoever reached it first would change everything. In 1939, their design bureaus were merged, not by their desire, by order from above. That was when Lippisch brought his delta wing blueprints to a meeting. He laid them on the table, explained the idea, waited for a reaction. Silence filled the room. Then, someone said out loud what everyone was thinking. This won't fly. Lippisch silently gathered his blueprints, stood up, and said one phrase that everyone in that room remembered later. It's already flying. He was right. His gliders were already in the air. People just didn't want to believe it. But convincing people with words is one thing. Convincing them with a real aircraft is quite another. And for that, a component was needed, without which this whole story would remain just a beautiful theory on paper. Fuel was needed. Special fuel. Fuel that didn't exist in nature yet. Or rather, it did exist, but it would have been better if it hadn't. This substance had no color, almost transparent, a bit oily in appearance. If you poured it into a glass, an ordinary liquid, nothing special, you could walk past it and not pay attention. But the smell. Everyone who worked with Takeoff described it the same way. Sharp. Alien. Nothing like what a person encounters in everyday life. One engineer wrote in his diary, short and precise, the smell of something that has no place among humans. Takeoff was concentrated hydrogen peroxide, 80% and higher. For comparison, the hydrogen peroxide you see at a pharmacy is 3%. 10% is already an industrial bleach that requires gloves and goggles. 80% is a completely different world. Upon contact with any organic material, it began to react instantly. Fabric, wood, rubber, human skin. The reaction wasn't just chemical, it was violent, irreversible. The ground crew working with this fuel wore special suits, not for comfort, for survival. The smallest crack in the protection, a stray drop, a clumsy movement during refueling, that was enough. But T-Stoff was only half the equation. The second component of the fuel system was C-Stoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol, a dark liquid with a smell that soaked into clothes permanently and wouldn't wash out. On its own, C-Stoff was toxic if inhaled, but that was manageable. The problem began when these two substances met. In the engine, they met in the combustion chamber, exactly where they were supposed to. The reaction was instantaneous and monstrously powerful. The temperature in the chamber jumped to 600 degrees in a fraction of a second. That reaction pushed the aircraft forward at a speed no one had dreamed of before. But here's the question. What happened if they met where they weren't supposed to? If a pipe leaked? If a joint came apart during landing? If a hard landing on the skid deformed the fuel system and the two components mixed outside the engine? The answer is short. The aircraft disappeared. It didn't burn. It didn't explode in the conventional sense. It literally disappeared, in a fraction of a second, in a cloud of steam and a chemical reaction so intense that practically nothing remained of the structure. Everyone knew this. The engineers knew, the technical staff knew, the pilots knew. And here, I want you to stop for a second. Imagine you are offered to get into a machine. You know exactly that if something goes wrong during landing, you won't even have time to realize what happened. You know the fuel composition. You've read the incident reports. You've seen what was left of other machines. And you still buckle up. This isn't recklessness. This is something else. We will return to this later, when we meet the people who did it, and you will understand why. But first, we need to deal with the aircraft itself. Because the fuel was insane. But the wing was genius. So genius that engineers around the world spent decades trying to figure out exactly how Lippisch came up with it. And some still cannot give a precise answer. Take a sheet of paper. Fold it into a paper airplane. An ordinary one, like you made as a child. A long nose, two straight wings on the sides, a tail in the back. Throw it. It will fly normally, predictably, obediently. And now imagine you tear off the tail. And instead of straight wings, you make one big triangle. Throw it again. Most likely, nothing good will happen. But here's the paradox. At a certain speed, a speed that an ordinary paper airplane will never reach, the triangle starts to work better. Much better. It cuts through the air differently. It doesn't fight the flow. It uses it. That is exactly what Lippisch understood. Before anyone else. Almost intuitively. Let's figure out why this works. Not boringly, I promise. Because what happens here with physics is almost a magic trick. When a plane flies slowly, the air manages to flow around the wings smoothly. It's like water around an oar you are slowly pulling through a river. Everything is calm. Everything is predictable. When speed increases, the picture changes. The air starts to compress in front of the wing. Zones of high pressure form. Resistance arises that simply doesn't exist at low speeds. The plane seems to start pushing against an invisible wall. A straight wing at such speeds is a problem. It creates that wall sooner than necessary. A swept back wing, Lippisch's triangle, does something tricky. It meets the air not with a direct front, but at an angle. The flow seems to slide along the leading edge before reaching the main surface. Pressure is distributed differently. The invisible wall is pushed further, to where speeds are even higher. It was a revolution, just drawn with a pencil on paper. But there was one problem, a serious one. One about which there was nothing in the textbooks of that time, because no one had reached it yet. The problem was called the transonic regime. Imagine, you are flying. Speed is increasing. 800 kilometers per hour, 900, 950, and at some point, something strange happens. The controls stop listening. They don't break. They don't jam. They just stop working as they should. You push the control stick. The plane reacts with a delay. Or doesn't react at all. Or reacts, but in the opposite direction. This isn't a failure. It's physics. At transonic speeds, the air around different parts of the plane moves at different speeds. In some places, it has already reached the speed of sound, and in others, it hasn't. Shock waves form. Invisible walls of compressed air that change the entire behavior of the machine. Aerodynamic forces are redistributed unpredictably. The center of pressure shifts. In the 30s and 40s of the 20th century, this phenomenon didn't even have a proper name. It was just called compressibility, as if it were something minor and understandable. In reality, it was a barrier. A physical barrier that was only known in theory. No one flew there long enough to understand what was happening. Until the Komet. And here's what is most striking about this entire story. Lippisch's delta wing behaved better in these conditions than any alternative. Not perfectly, but better. It was as if it was created for a world that didn't exist yet. For speeds no one had reached yet. Coincidence? Genius? Or just a man who watched birds long enough to understand what equations couldn't explain yet? I think the third. But all of this remained theory until one specific day, until one specific man, and until one specific flight, after which the engineers looked at each other, and no one knew what to say. Because the instrument showed a number that no one believed. August 13th, 1941, early morning, Peenemünde Airfield in northern Germany. The air over the runway is still cold, so cold you can see your breath. A few technicians stand to the side, silent, watching. In the cockpit of the Messerschmitt Me 163 sits Heini Dittmar. He is 32 years old. He is Germany's best glider pilot. Perhaps the world's best glider pilot. A man with absolute spatial awareness who feels the air the way most people feel solid ground under their feet. That is why they chose him. Dittmar was not a military pilot. He was a test pilot, a man whose job was to fly where others hadn't yet. Find out what happens there. Return. Tell the story. The last 2 points, desirable, but not guaranteed. The engine was started by tow. The first versions of the Komet couldn't take off independently at full thrust. They were accelerated from the ground, and only then did the pilot engage the rocket engine. This itself was an adventure. A sharp jolt, an instant gain in speed, a sensation that had no comparison. Dittmar later described the first engine engagement with one phrase, as if someone very big pushed you in the back, very unexpectedly, very insistently. The plane went up, fast, very fast. Unusually fast, even for a man who had flown everything that could be flown in those years. The ground didn't move away as usual. It just disappeared downwards, as if someone had pulled it out from under his feet. Altitude increased, speed increased. Dittmar held the machine steady, felt every movement, every vibration, every change in control behavior. He wasn't just flying, he was reading the aircraft like an experienced musician reads an unfamiliar score. Fast, attentively, ready for any note. Speed crossed 800 kilometers per hour. Then 850. And here, what the engineers warned about began to happen. The very compressibility. The controls became heavier. The plane started to react with a barely noticeable delay. The nose pulled down slightly, on its own, without a command from the pilot. Anyone else in his place would have reduced thrust, shed speed, returned to the zone where everything is clear and predictable. Dittmar added thrust. Speed crossed 900. The shaking intensified. Then, suddenly, became less. The controls became softer again. It was strange. It was illogical. It was as if the plane decided to calm down for a second, as if the physics around it had taken a step back. Dittmar glanced at the speed gauge. 1,004 kilometers per hour. He stared at this number for a few seconds, then reduced thrust. The plane started to slow down. The shaking returned and disappeared again when the speed fell below 900. Dittmar came in to land, released the skid, landed. The technicians ran up. He took off his helmet, climbed out of the cockpit, looked at them. "Is the instrument working?" "Yes, Mr. Dittmar. Checked this morning." "Then we have a problem." He paused for a second. "Or we have no problems at all. I haven't figured it out yet." 1,004 kilometers per hour. That was about 85% of the speed of sound. Faster than any human had ever flown. Faster than was considered safe. Faster than the calculations predicted. And no one, neither Dittmar, nor the engineers, nor Lippisch himself, fully understood what happened there, at an altitude of 10 kilometers. Why the shaking stopped. Why the aircraft calmed down instead of falling apart. It was the first human touch of the sound barrier. 6 years before the American Chuck Yeager officially broke it, in an aircraft created in such a hurry that some blueprints were finalized right on the airfield. Dittmar made this entry in the flight log. The engineers read it, discussed it, reported it, and then decided the plane could be prepared for the next stage. Because it's one thing to fly records alone over a quiet airfield, and quite another to bring this machine into service, to train people, many people, people who had never flown anything even remotely similar. And here the story becomes completely different, because finding such people turned out to be unexpectedly easy. There were enough of them. There were plenty of volunteers. The question was another: what exactly to tell them at the briefing? Imagine a recruitment ad for volunteers, without extra details, without technical descriptions. Simply, pilots needed. Experience on jet technology is not required. Jet technology barely exists yet. Something else is required. Willingness to fly what no one has flown before. There were many volunteers. This in itself says something important about the people of that time. Something difficult to understand today, in a world where every plane undergoes thousands of hours of testing before the first passenger sits in it. In 1943, people climbed into machines that existed in a single copy, which were drawn on paper only yesterday, and they flew. The first squadron of the Messerschmitt Me 163 was formed in 1943. Major Walter Eisner was appointed commander, a pilot with vast experience, a calm disposition, and a rare ability to explain complex things in simple words. He needed this ability very much, because there was a lot to explain. Let's start with takeoff. A normal plane takes off on wheels, accelerates along the runway, lifts off, retracts gear, flies. Everything is logical. Everything is clear. The Komet took off on a jettisonable trolley. A special two-wheeled structure was rolled under the fuselage. The plane accelerated, and at the moment of liftoff, the trolley simply fell to the ground. It was picked up and used again, and the plane went into the sky, without wheels. At all. Instead, there was a landing skid under the fuselage and small protective skids under the wings. Landing on a skid is a separate art. No brakes in the usual sense. No possibility to go around if something went wrong. There was simply no fuel for a second approach. One approach, one attempt. Landing speed, nearly 200 kilometers per hour. The skid touches the ground, and then everything depends on how smooth the runway is and how steady the pilot's hand is. At the first briefing, Eisner looked at his new pilots for a long time, silently, then said, "I will teach you takeoff. I will teach you the climb. You will figure out the engine after the first 2 flights. But landing, you will have to figure out landing yourselves. Every time anew. Because every landing in this machine is slightly different." One of the pilots raised a hand. "And if it doesn't work the first time?" Eisner was silent for a second. "It will work, because there won't be a second time." The room laughed, a bit nervously, but they laughed. Here is what is important to understand about these people. They weren't fatalists. They weren't people who didn't care. Most of them were young, 25, 27 years old. Many had families. They all understood the risks perfectly. And they still laughed at the briefing. Because when you are in love with the sky, truly in love, so that you dream of it at night and think about it in the morning, you are ready to accept its terms. Any terms, even the harshest ones. Among the first pilots was 26-year-old Lieutenant Herbert Langer. He came as a volunteer. Wrote the report 3 times. The first 2 times they didn't take him. He seemed too young. The third time, they took him. They asked him, why? He answered simply, I want to know what the world looks like from there, from that speed. No one has seen the world from such a speed yet. His answer was written into his file, without comment. The training lasted several months. First, gliders. Lippisch's tailless gliders, to get used to the delta wing and the unusual behavior of the machine. Then, the first flights on the Comet, without an engine, on a tow. Then, with an engine, but at low thrust. And finally, full mode. Those who went through this described the first flight at full thrust the same way. In different words, but the same in essence. Nothing prepares you for this. Nothing at all. By the summer of 1944, the first trained pilots were ready. The machines, ready. The fuel, loaded. And the world, which until that moment didn't know what jet aviation was in real combat, was about to find out. Very soon. Very unexpectedly. With very specific consequences. Because when Allied pilots first saw the Comet in the air, they didn't immediately understand what they were seeing. This is an important detail. We will return to it in a minute. July 26, 1944. Over German territory, at an altitude of 8,000 meters, a group of American bombers is flying. Boeing B-17, flying fortresses. Heavy, powerful, well-armed, covered by escort fighters. The crews are doing their job. A routine route, a routine altitude. Everything is proceeding normally. And suddenly, one of the side gunners notices something out of the corner of his eye. Something moving from below. Fast. Very fast. He turns the turret, but the object has already passed by. Already above. Already barely visible. What was that? He asks over the intercom. Don't know, replies the second gunner. It just flew by. A plane? Don't know. Didn't manage to see. This was the Comet, the first combat mission of the Messerschmitt Me 163, and it went exactly like that, like a ghost, like something for which people didn't have words yet. The speed of the Comet in combat mode was about 850 kilometers per hour. The speed of Allied bombers, about 450. The speed of escort fighters, about 650 at best. Try to imagine this difference through an image. You are standing on a subway platform. A train rushes past you at full speed. You see it, but you don't manage to see the details. It has already disappeared. That's approximately what the appearance of the Comet looked like to Allied pilots. Only the train was also shooting. The first weeks of the Comet's combat use were a real shock for the Allied aviation. Not because the losses were catastrophic. No, the losses were quite moderate. The shock was something else. The very fact of such a machine's existence. British Royal Air Force pilot Geoffrey Wilkins wrote in his report after his first encounter with the Comet, briefly and precisely, "The object passed by me with such speed that I only managed to think one thing. This is not a plane. This is something else." He was right. It really was something else. The Allied command reacted quickly. All reports of encounters with the new object were immediately classified. Information gathering began. Photographs from reconnaissance aircraft, pilot testimonies, analysis of debris, wherever it was. Intelligence tried to understand, what is it? How does it work? How many are there? And most importantly, how to fight it. The answer to the last question came unexpectedly quickly, and it was simultaneously simple and bitter. No way. In the air? No way. At cruising speed, the Comet was unreachable. No Allied fighter could catch it. No one could get into position for an attack. Even the fastest machines of that time, North American Mustangs, Supermarine Spitfires of the latest modifications, lag behind by 200 or even 250 kilometers per hour. 250 kilometers per hour difference in speed. This isn't an advantage. This is another dimension. The Allied command analysts held a special meeting, a long one, a closed one, with the participation of the best aviation engineers. The conclusion was formulated shortly and without embellishments. Intercepting this aircraft in the air by traditional methods is impossible. Period. But then someone in that room asked a question that changed the entire tactic. And what happens to it on the ground? And here, something very important was revealed. Something that the Comet, despite its fantastic speed, couldn't change at all. Because it wasn't a technical problem. It was a physical inevitability. Every plane takes off at some point, and every plane lands at some point. And in those few minutes, during takeoff and landing, the fastest plane in the world was as vulnerable as any other. This vulnerability was found, remembered, and began to be used. But before telling you exactly how, we need to stop for a second. Because in parallel with this, another story was unfolding. A story about how the main threat to the Comet was never from the outside. There is a rule in engineering. The more complex the system, the simpler its weak point. The fastest plane in the world, a revolutionary wing, an engine that changed the physics around it, fuel from a chemist's nightmare. All this together created a machine that was impossible to catch in the air. But every time before takeoff, the same thing happened. The pilot climbed into the cockpit. Technicians rolled up the takeoff trolley. Refuelers in protective suits finished working with the fuel. The engine started at low RPM. The plane slowly taxied to the runway. Slowly. That's it. That is the weak spot. During the acceleration along the runway, the Comet was vulnerable for about a minute and a half. Speed hadn't been gained yet. Altitude? Zero. Maneuver? Minimal. Any fighter that managed to get into position over the airfield in advance had a few seconds for an attack. A few seconds is not much, but sometimes enough. The Allied command developed a tactic that pilots called simply hunting at the lair. Patrol groups of fighters were on duty within a few kilometers of the known Comet airfields. They didn't try to catch it in the air. They just waited. Waited for takeoff. Or landing. Landing was even better than takeoff. Because a landing Comet was completely predictable. The direction of the approach, known. Speed, known. Altitude on the glide path, known. And most importantly, the pilot had no choice at that moment. He couldn't go around, couldn't abruptly change direction. No fuel left. He was going down along the only possible trajectory. This was a trap from which there was no exit. The German command understood the problem perfectly. The answer was logical. Cover the airfields with anti-aircraft artillery so densely that patrolling over them would become impossible. Dozens of anti-aircraft guns around each Comet base, plus duty escort fighters that were supposed to meet returning machines. The system worked. Sometimes. But it had a flaw that could not be fixed by any amount of anti-aircraft guns. The Comet returned from missions unexpectedly, by different routes, at different times, because each combat mission unfolded in its own way. Planning the exact return time was impossible, which meant duty escort fighters were not always there exactly when needed. Allied pilots understood this quickly. They stopped trying to be on duty constantly. Instead, they started tracking patterns. When the Comet usually took off. When it usually returned. What weather conditions German commanders preferred for sorties. This wasn't a dogfight. This was a game of chess. And in this game, the Comet had another problem that neither anti-aircraft guns nor escort fighters could solve. The problem was in the fuel itself. Refueling the Comet took time. A lot of time by military aviation standards. Because working with T-Stoff and C-Stoff required caution that could not be rushed. Special suits, special procedures, a special sequence of actions that absolutely could not be violated. This meant a lot of time passed between missions. The plane stood on the ground for a long time, vulnerable, motionless. One day at one of the airfields, a technician violated the refueling sequence, was in a hurry, mixed the components in the wrong order. The plane didn't take off that day. It didn't take off anywhere, ever again. By the autumn of 1944, it became clear. The tactical situation was not developing as planned. The Komet was invincible in the air, but it spent 7 minutes in the air, and all the rest of the time it was on the ground. And the ground was becoming more and more dangerous. But here is what is interesting. Here is what is truly amazing about this story. All these problems, tactical, logistical, related to vulnerability on the ground, were solvable, theoretically. Under other circumstances, they could have been solved. The circumstances were different. And while the staffs thought about tactics, while engineers worked on the next versions of the plane, while logisticians tried to organize fuel supplies, somewhere aside from all this, a story was unfolding that no official document reflected. A story about what was happening to the people inside this machine. Not the plane, the people. There are things that don't make it into official reports, not because they are hidden, simply because they are hard to record. It is hard to find the right words for what happens inside a person who wakes up every morning, eats breakfast, puts on a flight suit, and goes to sit in a machine that can disappear in a fraction of a second. This isn't heroism in the beautiful sense of the word. This is something quieter, something deeper. Let's talk about what was really happening. Takeoff behaved unpredictably during a hard landing. An impact with the ground deformed the fuel pipes. Sometimes only a little, a micro crack, barely noticeable. But that was enough. The two components met where they shouldn't have met. The result was instantaneous. The pilots knew this, all of them. This wasn't a secret inside the squadron. This was part of the reality that everyone dealt with in their own way. One of the mechanics who serviced the Comet remembered later, many years after everything ended, that the hardest thing about his job wasn't the fuel, not the protective suits, not the complexity of the maintenance. The hardest thing was looking into the pilot's eyes before takeoff. Not because they looked scared, just the opposite. They looked calm, focused, sometimes almost serene. And that serenity was scarier than any fear. Among the pilots of the first squadron was Lieutenant Otto Brenner, 28 years old, from Hamburg. Before aviation, a technical university student, passionate about mechanics from childhood. He had a habit that the whole squadron knew about. Before every flight, every single one, without exception, he would stop by the plane. Look at his hands. Just look for a few seconds, then put on his gloves and climb into the cockpit. Once, he was asked, why? He didn't answer immediately, thought, then said quietly, I look at my hands to remember why I am here. Not for the order, for what these hands can do. Can hold the stick, can lead this machine where it can go. As long as they can do it, I must be here. This is not from a textbook about heroism. This is just a person who found his way to live with what he knew. The physiological load on Comet pilots was huge, apart from everything related to the fuel. At speeds over 800 kilometers per hour, the G-forces during maneuvers reached values at which blood left the head faster than the body could compensate. Vision narrowed, reaction slowed. Pilots described this differently. Some said, a gray veil at the edges. Others, a feeling that the head becomes heavy like a stone. Some, just silence inside, for a second that lasts too long. During that second, a lot could go wrong. The squadron's medical service kept detailed records. Every pilot went through a short interview after the flight. What he felt, where it hurt, what he noticed. These records later became the basis for an entire section of aviation medicine that is now studied in every flight school in the world. Comet pilots, without knowing it, were paving the way for everyone who would fly after them. There was another aspect that was rarely spoken of, psychological. 7 minutes of engine, then silence, gliding. Imagine that moment. The engine goes silent. The roar that filled everything around disappears. Only the whistle of the air remains. And the silence in the cockpit is so complete, so unexpected after the roar of the engine that for a few seconds the pilot just adapts to it. Then, work. Calculating the approach, choosing the runway, assessing altitude and speed. All this without the possibility to change his mind, without a second attempt. One of the pilots wrote in a personal diary, not in an official report, in a personal diary that was found much later, one phrase that I cannot get out of my head since I read it. The most honest thing about this plane is that it doesn't give you the possibility to lie to yourself. You are either ready or you are not. It knows, and you know. They were ready, again and again, every day. And here is what is important to understand. Here is what I want you to take away from this section. These people weren't special in the sense that we usually imagine heroes. They didn't have capes. They didn't give loud speeches. They just did their job every morning on a machine that no one understood until the end, with fuel that everyone feared, at speeds for which medical protocols didn't exist yet. They believed a little more, and the engineers would solve all the problems. Finish, refine, make it safer, faster, more reliable. They were right about the engineers. But regarding time, here, everything turned out more complicated. Because time is the only resource that this program had catastrophically little of from the very beginning. There is a type of tragedy that has no villain. No one made a wrong decision. No one made a fatal mistake. Simply, a few circumstances converged at one point, and what could have changed everything, changed nothing. The Komet story is just such a tragedy. Let's look at the numbers, not boringly, through an image. Imagine you built the fastest car in the world. It is faster than anything that exists. It passes competitors so that they don't even see its taillights. But you have one problem. The fuel for it is produced at one single factory. A small one, a slow one. A factory that physically cannot produce more than a certain amount of liters per day. And this factory is located in a city over which enemy planes fly every week. That is roughly how the situation with the Komet looked towards the end of 1944. T-Stoff, concentrated hydrogen peroxide of the required purity, was difficult to produce even in peacetime. It required special equipment, special raw materials, specially trained personnel. In the conditions of 1944, all this was a deficit. Production of the planes themselves also lagged behind the plans. They planned to produce several dozen machines a month. Reality was different. Components didn't arrive on time. Factories were moved. Supply chains broke. By August 1944, there were about 70 aircraft in service. 70 out of several hundred planned. But even these 70 couldn't fly simultaneously, because there wasn't enough fuel. Because there weren't enough trained pilots. Because there weren't enough spare parts. Because there wasn't enough time. And here, at this point, the Komet story acquires that special quality that distinguishes a real tragedy from just a failure. By the moment production started picking up speed, when the assembly line finally worked more or less stably, the situation outside changed so much that it no longer mattered. The Komet's airfields were under constant pressure. Fuel reserves were getting smaller. Experienced pilots, the very ones who went through long training, who knew this machine like one can only know what is trying to kill you, there were fewer and fewer of them. Training a new pilot for the Komet is months, on gliders, on training machines, on flights without an engine, gradually, step by step. There were no months. And here I want to stop for a second, because there is a temptation, a big temptation, to say, what if everything was different? If they had started earlier? If there were more resources? If there were other conditions? But this is the wrong question. The right question sounds different. What happens when technology outruns its time so much that the system around it simply doesn't have time to readjust? The Komet was an answer to a threat that already existed, but it appeared at a moment when everything around it was already moving in a different direction. Too fast, too late to turn this movement around. This is not a story about defeat. This is a story about time. About how the fastest machine of its time became a hostage of the slowest resource: time. There just wasn't enough of it. But here is what is amazing. Here is what turns everything upside down. Ideas, unlike planes, fuel, and pilots, do not end. They don't burn. They don't need to be refueled. They just wait. And when everything ended, when the last comet lowered its skid to the ground for the last time, the ideas were already moving on their own, in all directions at once. And what happened to them next is a separate story, no less incredible than the one we have been telling so far. 1945. Spring. Across Europe, Allied troops enter cities, airfields, factories. They are looking for a lot: equipment, documents, technologies. But a special list, a special order that technical teams on both sides received, concerned one specific plane: the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. Americans were looking for it. The British were looking for it. Soviet specialists were looking for it. All at the same time. All with the same understanding that this plane is not just a trophy. It is a window to the future. Several dozen surviving machines were disassembled, studied, copied with an accuracy to the last bolt. Lippisch's blueprints ended up in the hands of engineers around the world. The pilots and designers who worked with the Comet gave testimonies: long, detailed, technically accurate. It was called Operation Paperclip in the American version. German specialists, engineers, scientists, designers received American citizenship in exchange for knowledge. Among them was Alexander Lippisch. He moved to Iowa, worked in an aviation laboratory, kept drawing delta wings. In America, in a world that now understood what he had known since the 30s. And the knowledge spread further. The Soviet Union received its copies of the Comet and its group of German specialists. The British received theirs. The French, theirs. Every aviation power in the world worked for several years after the end of the confrontation on jet planes, in the design of which ideas born in Lippisch's design bureau were present directly or indirectly. But the Comet's main legacy is not in the specific planes that followed. The main legacy is in the wing shape, the swept-back wing, Lippisch's delta. That very idea that was laughed at in a meeting in 1939. Today, it is on every jet plane in the world. Every one, without exception. Next time you are at the airport, stop by the panoramic window. Look at the planes on the tarmac. Any airliner, Airbus, Boeing, any other. Look at the wing. Do you see this characteristic bend back? This sweep of the leading edge? This is Lippisch. This is the Comet. This is 1939, and a man who looked at birds and saw equations. A straight line, without brakes. From the Delta glider over Munich to the wing of an airliner that will take you on vacation tomorrow. But the swept-back wing is only the beginning of the list. Aviation medicine, understanding pilot physiology at high speeds and high altitudes, G-forces, oxygen starvation, the influence of dynamic pressure on the human body. All this started with the medical records of the Comet Squadron, with short post-flight interviews, with pilots' diaries. Today, every military pilot in the world undergoes training that is based on data collected, among other things, here, on these flights, by these people. Transonic aerodynamics, the science of what happens to a plane at speeds close to the speed of sound. Before the Comet, this was pure theory. After it, practice, supported by real data of real flights. Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in 1947 in the Bell X-1 plane, in a plane for the design of which American engineers used, among other things, data obtained from studying the Comet. Dittmar touched this barrier in 1941, without special training, without understanding what exactly was happening, simply because the plane went there, and he didn't reduce thrust. 6 years of difference, and a direct link between the two moments. There is another detail that is rarely spoken about: the ejection seat system. On later versions of the Comet, engineers worked on an emergency escape system for high speeds. An ordinary parachute jump at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour meant instant loss of consciousness from the dynamic pressure. Something else was needed. The concept of a seat that ejects the pilot from the cockpit, the ejection seat, was not invented on the Comet. But it was here, on this plane, that engineers first faced the need to make this system truly reliable. Because the price of error was absolute. Today, ejection seats are on all combat planes in the world. They have saved thousands of lives. Their history leads from different points, but one of these points is here, in the small cockpit of a plane with a delta wing and 7 minutes of fuel. That is what a real legacy is. Not a museum exhibit behind glass, not a line in an aviation history textbook. A legacy is when an idea continues to save people 80 years after it was first tested in practice. And when next time you look out the porthole and see a swept-back wing, now you know where it came from. But there is one more thing. The last one. The most important one. We talked about the plane. We talked about physics, about chemistry, about tactics, about the legacy. But at the very beginning of this video was one image. A pilot in the cockpit. 7 minutes. And now, when you know everything, it is time to return to him. Let's return to the cockpit. The same morning, the same airfield, the same cold air in which you can see your breath, the same takeoff trolley under the fuselage, the same smell, sharp, alien, unlike anything else. 7 minutes. But now you know everything that the pilot who sat there knew. You know about the delta wing and why it works at speeds where ordinary physics starts to break. You know about T-Stoff and C-Stoff, what is in the tanks a few centimeters from his feet. You know about 7 minutes of engine and about the silence that sets in after. About one approach attempt for landing, about the skid that sometimes didn't release. You know about Dittmar, who looked at the instrument and saw 1,004 kilometers per hour. About Langer, who wanted to see the world from a speed no one had seen yet. About Brenner, who looked at his hands every morning before putting on his gloves. You know all this. And now I want to ask you a question. A simple question, for which there is no right answer. If you knew everything they knew, would you sit in this cockpit? Do not rush with the answer. Think. Because the answer to this question says something important. Not about the plane, about people. About what a person is capable of when he believes in what he does. When he feels that he is standing on the edge of something that didn't exist before him. These people weren't made of different material than we are. They didn't have superpowers. They were just as afraid, just as doubtful, just as much wanted to go home in the evening. They just found something for which it was worth hitting the gas. Heine Dittmar lived a long life. After everything ended, he worked as an aviation consultant. Sometimes he gave interviews. He was asked about that flight, about 1,004 kilometers per hour, about what he felt when he looked at the instrument. He always answered the same way, with a slight smile. I wasn't thinking about the record. I was thinking about the fact that the plane stopped shaking. That was pleasant. That's all. No pathos, no loud words. Just a man who liked that the shaking stopped. Alexander Lippisch lived to be 76. Until his last days, he drew. Delta wings, tailless designs, flying discs, yes, he did that too. He never stopped. Because for him, the sky was never a place where planes fly. The sky was a place where equations live. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet was produced for less than 2 years. About 360 units were built. Of them, significantly fewer participated in real missions. Today, several surviving machines stand in museums, in Washington, in London, in Munich. You can go up, look, touch if they allow. A small plane. Unexpectedly small. When you see it in person, you are always surprised. Sharp nose, delta wing. A cockpit that barely fits one person. It's hard to believe that this thing, flew faster than anything that flew before it. that inside this small triangle sat a living person and looked at an instrument that showed 1,000 kilometers per hour. But it is true. And here's the last thing I want to tell you. Every time humanity took a real step forward, not a small step, but a big one, after which the world becomes different, someone specific stood behind this step. Not a concept, not a program, not a budget. A person. With a name. With hands that he looked at before takeoff. With a smile when the plane stopped shaking. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet is not just a plane in an aviation history textbook. It is proof that a person is capable of building a machine that flies faster than he himself understands how. And sitting in it. And flying. Because sometimes it is more important to fly than to understand.